Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session, The Myth of the Underground Railroad. If you have any questions for the presenters, please type them in the chat box and we will address the questions during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. It is my honor now to introduce the presenter, Dr. Rosick. And Dr. Janet Rosick works as an associate professor at American Public University. So go take it away, Dr. Rosick.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me here today and joining me. And I was explaining that I kind of have this formal presentation that I was going to do, and then I think I'm just going to chat kind of off of my formal presentation. But I would start to say that growing up in Northwest Ohio, which is where most of my elementary school career took place, I would say that the Underground Railroad was probably one of the biggest myths I learned in my elementary classroom. So I had kind of grown up with this idea that it was this very well organized system where enslaved individuals went from one house to the next house, guided along their path. And as I have jumped into this research, I have found that that is not the case at all. As the story of the Underground Railroad unfolded, a surprising number of people became more and more willing to break the law in order to mobilize friends and families in cooperation with even local law enforcement who had turned a blind eye. People quickly learned that they could make a difference regarding slavery and that they were only limited by their imaginations. But Isaac Beck, a station master in Southern Ohio, wrote, "There was no regular organization, no constitution, no officers, no laws or agreement or rule except the Golden Rule." As part of the abolitionist movement, the existence of the Underground Railroad intensified the debate over slavery and symbolized the urgency of Blacks and the willingness of whites to bring an end to slavery. Exploring these individual local tales helps us to understand the complexities of the Underground Railroad and how creativity was needed and how each journey was truly a unique experience. It was not a uniform journey through Ohio on the Underground Railroad. The challenge with researching the Underground Railroad is the relationship between myth and documented history. The success of the Underground Railroad really depended on the moral commitment, efficiency, and creativity of those involved. The organization did not rest solely on the amazing efforts of famous individuals. In Ohio, that would include like Reverend John Rankin, Laura Haviland, kind of on a more national scope, famous individuals like Harriet Tubman and William Still and Frederick Douglass. But it actually relied on the countless efforts of everyday individuals. Farmers, businessmen, housewives, preachers, clerks are all obviously civilians like ourselves. They're ordinary people with ordinary lives in the ordinary landscape of antebellum America. However, sometimes we see random acts of kindness that aren't always recorded, but inserted these individuals into this Underground Railroad movement or into the abolitionist movement. With the radicalization of the abolition movement, those participating in the Underground Railroad became known as radicals, lawbreakers, or even trespassers. People's involvement in the Underground Railroad became dramatic in retrospect. In Ohio, we have the collections of Dr. Wilbur Siebert from 1890. He started to record and do oral history interviews with individuals that had been involved in the Underground Railroad. And through these recordings, he was able to kind of create this map that I have up on screen, documenting the various routes of the Underground Railroad. It became cool to have participated in the Underground Railroad. It occupies a romantic place in the American collective memory, but the true story is actually rather elusive and it's clouded in secrecy. Because the Underground Railroad was secretive, Its memory has devolved into myth and legend, evoking tales of tunnels, disguises, mysterious codes, midnight rides, and harrowing escapes. A good friend of mine likes to tell me a story about where he was house hunting in Delaware, Ohio, and it was an older house constructed in the 1890s, actually. And the realtor used it as a selling point for him. She was like, "Look, this house is old. It was a stop on the Underground Railroad," even though it had been constructed 30 years after the Underground Railroad stopped operating. It became an epic tale of high drama, moral courage, religious inspirations, and personal transformations. For much of its history, people assumed the Underground Railroad was this kind of monochromatic narrative of whites helping blacks. However, the organization actually developed into a very diverse, very flexible, interlocking system, sometimes even overlapping. There was no one direct route that involved thousands of activists and relied on a really broad infrastructure of different places and people in order to transport messages as well as to protect the individuals that were using the Underground Railroad, those creating this network, and even those choosing to look the other way. As African Americans settled north of the Ohio River, it was not the promised land that many hoped to find. And I think that is another myth of the Underground Railroad, is that being raised in the north or north of the Mason-Dixon line, we have this idea that once people reached Ohio, they would be free. And in that understanding of freedom, we tend to think that that also meant equal, or I would argue perhaps the general public tends to think that that meant equal. That was actually far from the case. At any time, a freed African American living in Ohio, their homes, places of employment, persons were subject to searches or attacks with no legal repercussions. They did not enjoy the equal protection of American laws. In 1803, Ohio actually joined the Union as the first free state after the American Revolution. Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 determined that no slavery would be permitted in the Northwest Territory. Many kind of assumed that any state coming out of the Northwest Territory would then be a free state, but that really wasn't the case. Each state, when they applied for statehood, had to write their own state constitution. When Ohio passed their state constitution, they upheld no slavery being allowed in the state of Ohio by one vote. Ohio delegates then, after being admitted to the Union, had to start the job of creating a state government. In the first General Assembly, delegates passed actually the first Ohio Black Code, which was passed in 1804. Section 1 of this Black Code reads, "Be it enacted by the General Assembly of the State of Ohio that from and after the first day of June next, no black or mulatto persons shall be permitted to settle or reside in this state, unless he or she shall first produce a fair certificate from some court within the United States, or his or her actual freedom, which certificate shall be attested by the clerk of said court, and the seal thereof annexed to by said clerk." Section 3 goes on to further explain that no person or persons residing in the state shall be permitted to hire or any way employ a black or mulatto person unless they have this certificate. The Black Code of 1804 limited the lives of African American settlers, and it also upheld the 1793 Fugitive Slave Law by permitting a claimant of any enslaved person the right to secure a warrant for the return of their property and fined individuals aiding runaways $50. In 1807, the General Assembly passed a stricter a stricter Black Code. It was passed in 1807 and then reinforced or reenacted in 1811, 1816, 1824, and 1831. The stricter code required free Black and mulattoes to post bond, ensuring their good behavior. In some places, this could be as high as a $500 bond that had to be posted. Also, a promise that those individuals would not become wards of the state. It also restricted Blacks and mulattoes from testifying in court against a white person and increased the fine of those aiding or hiring an Black or mulatto person without proper manumission papers to $100. African Americans could not vote in the state of Ohio. They could not hold office. They could not serve on juries, and they could not attend public schools. So they were really regulated in their freedoms. Complaints about slave catchers throughout the state also prompted the General Assembly to address the protections that they could guarantee of free African Americans settling. So while we simultaneously see Black laws that are restricting the activities of African Americans, at the state level, we also see a series of kidnapping laws that are passed. The first set of kidnapping laws was passed in 1819, again in 1824, and then again in 1831. The kidnapping laws prohibited any person to be seized through violence with the intent of transporting them out of the area, to be to have to appear before a judge or a justice of the peace in the county where they were seized, and the judge had to establish proof of identity as well as proof of property. And anyone caught violating could be charged with a misdemeanor and confined to hard labor of 3 to 7 years. So while we simultaneously see these restrictions being placed on African Americans, we also see the General Assembly working hard to protect the freed African Americans that are living in the state. However, this created tensions between Ohio and our neighbor Kentucky. Kentucky plantation owners frequently appealed to their legislature, worried about the number of individuals crossing the Ohio River and seeking their freedom. Kentucky legislature sent various resolutions to Ohio, arguing that Ohio was not defending the 1793 fugitive slave law or upholding the 1793 fugitive slave law. And in the late 1830s, we hosted 2 Kentucky commissioners, and Ohio authorities determined that there need to be a stricter fugitive slave law within the state of Ohio. So in May of 1839, Ohio's General Assembly passed its own fugitive slave law. It required that an affidavit for a warrant against a fugitive, which clearly identified the individual, and established the procedure for arrest and a court hearing where proof of ownership could be established. It also fined anyone prohibiting the execution of this warrant or knowingly assisting a runaway. It penalized individuals for issuing false manumission papers, and Section 11 specifically addressed kidnappers by penalizing anyone forcefully removing another person without sufficient legal authority. These are important because it's within these avenues that the abolitionist movement or those involved with the Underground Railroad seek to protect freedom for individuals moving and living within the state of Ohio. Now, Ohio's fugitive slave law became null and void rather quickly after 1842 Supreme Court ruling of Priggs versus Pennsylvania, where that Supreme Court ruling says that all slave catchers operated under that authority, federal authority. But Ohio worked, as many other northern states, worked to continue to pass restrictions on slave catchers and the processes they had to go through their kidnapping laws. The Underground Railroad specifically challenged these repressive slave laws thousands engaged in activities to morally subvert federal laws and challenge slavery. For the first time, people involved in the Underground Railroad asserted the principle of personal and active responsibility in order to advance the idea of human rights. Challenging the myth of the Underground Railroad by exploring the uncertainty of this network helps us to further understand how race developed in the United States. The movement of enslaved persons through Ohio, either legally or through the Underground Railroad, forced Ohioans to come face to face with the institution by creating a series of case laws. There was a early case in 1810 in Marietta where an enslaved woman, Jane, was awaiting trial. They were working to document proof of identity and proof of ownership for Jane. And she simply was permitted to walk out of jail and completely disappeared using the avenues of the Underground Railroad. Another case in 1812 in Delaware, the judge dismissed charges because he made the decision that he was going to enforce Ohio's kidnapping laws. So the slave catcher had forcefully captured an individual and didn't follow those processes set up by Ohio laws. In 1837, Salmon P. Chase argued in a Cincinnati argued in a Cincinnati case defending a young woman named Matilda. She had been employed by James Birney. Birney had hired her completely unaware that she was a fugitive, and a slave catcher had recognized her in the city of Cincinnati and arrested her in order to return the property. Birney was charged with harboring a fugitive. Chase argued that since the slave owner had voluntarily brought Matilda into Ohio, that the slave was free and not a fugitive. The judge disagreed with Chase's argument, ordered Matilda's return, and also fined Birney $50 under the Ohio Black Laws of 1807. As we continue to go through, we start to see notes of early abolitionists. And one thing that is important with the Underground Railroad and understanding the complexities of the event is that we tend to kind of, that monochromatic story is that it is whites helping blacks. But what we find in Ohio is that we actually find the early abolitionists from about 1800 or so to about the 1830s are actually being led by African Americans living in Ohio. So some of the early settlers, and that many argue are abolitionists, but my research isn't always supporting that argument, is we have Jacob Gaskins. He settled in Stark County. He was actually a received his freedom after his master had passed away, and he moved into Ohio in about 1817. Now, he settled on the eastern side of the state in Stark County, and when he passed away, his estate totaled 375 acres. While my research doesn't show that he was necessarily involved in the Underground Railroad, I do think it's interesting that most of the documents relating to Jacob Gaskins note that he was successful despite the odds against him in Ohio. Another early leader is Aunt Polly Jackson. Aunt Polly Jackson lived in an African American community just north of Ripley, known as Africa. Now, what's interesting is we do have a couple of different African American communities, neighborhoods, all under that name of Africa. So this is the one located just north of Ripley, Ohio, pretty close to the Ohio River. And she is known for getting involved in the activities of the Underground Railroad, frustrated on the number of slave catchers coming into her community and raiding homes, raiding businesses, and taking individuals out of their community. So she starts to arm herself with a butcher knife and boiling water, and she uses the boiling water to pour onto slave catchers that are attempting to enter into her home as she operated on the Underground Railroad. And I also found with her history that it was interesting that she frequently disguised herself as an old woman when traveling as a conductor, because oftentimes people did not see her as a threat as a disguised as an old woman, so she was not challenged or questioned. Some other early leaders are Basil Beal Norman. And Basil Beal Norman, while I also cannot find his involvement in the Underground Railroad, I think he has an interesting history in Ohio, because he is actually a Revolutionary War veteran. He was an indentured servant until the age of 21, served in the Revolutionary War, and then was awarded 400 acres for his service in the Revolutionary War, and settled in Ohio about 1814. And Richard Stanhope is interesting as well. You might be familiar with his name. He was a enslaved individual owned by President George Washington. He served as George Washington's valet during the Revolutionary War and received his freedom from Martha Washington on January 1st, 1801. He moved to Ohio and settled in Urbana, Ohio. His estate totaled 400 acres, and he became a reverend in the Baptist Church and was one of the founders of Kings Creek Baptist Church, which is one of the oldest Baptist churches in Ohio. Baptist Church and American Methodist, African Methodist Episcopal Church, AMEs, are important institutions in African American communities in Ohio, and are often linked to a valuable resource in the Underground Railroad. Now, while Richard Stanhope is not himself specifically connected to the Underground Railroad, his sons do have active involvement in the Underground Railroad. His two sons, David and Levi, were actually arrested for their activities in Urbana. They created a diversion, pulling slave catchers away from individuals that were hiding in Urbana, and that gave the conductors enough time to escort them on to another station in Bellefontaine, but they were arrested for subverting those actions. We see activities starting to increase. And so when we research the Underground Railroad in Ohio, we see activities starting to increase in the 1830s and increasing through the 1840s and the 1850s. And of course, a lot of the research in Ohio starts in Cincinnati as a key port city. So Cincinnati and Ripley, Portsmouth and Marietta are all key port cities for the Underground Railroad. People would move through the state of Ohio in a crisscross mismatch way of pattern, hopefully getting to the three key port cities on Lake Erie, which are Toledo, where I live, Sandusky, and then Cleveland. Activities included rescuing enslaved people passing through the port. Josiah Henson's slave narrative actually details his journey through Ohio. He even notes that when passing through the city, he was quickly surrounded by African Americans living in the city, urging him and his family with much opportunity to remain with them, and told us it was folly to go on, and in short, used all the arguments now so familiar to induce slaves to quit their masters. Josiah Henson had been enslaved in Maryland, and he attempted to actually purchase his family's freedom before deciding in 1830 to seek his freedom. It was himself, his wife, and 4 children that took the journey on the through Kentucky, Ohio, and Michigan. Josiah Henson actually carried two of the children, they were toddler age, on his back before the family settled in Dresden, Ontario, Canada. And I pick up his story from his narrative when the family reached Cincinnati. When they reached Cincinnati, they started to buy supplies and they were escorted by wagon about 30 miles north of Cincinnati, where they were left and told to head towards the Scioto River. They would travel at night and they rested during the day. When they reached the Scioto River, they started following General Hall's military road, which had been left over and abandoned after the War of 1812, to the northwest. And it cut through a tremendous amount of wilderness with very little provisions. Josiah Henson's wife fainted one day while causing great alarm for the family. Luckily, she was able to rest, and Josiah had a little bit of leftover dried beef that was able to revive her. When the family started walking again, they came upon a group of individuals in the woods, and Josiah realized that this was actually a group of natives, and realizing that it was too late to really hide, he directly approached the group of natives, but startled them. And they started screaming and they started to run away. And his wife pleaded with him to turn around, that they were going to be discovered. And Josiah claimed, "We've come too far on this road to actually turn around now." So he continued forward and then came along the village of wigwams and the chief. The two men were able to communicate and eventually calm the fears of Mrs. Henson, as well as the fears of the other natives. The other natives, Josiah guessed, had envisioned him to be the devil because of his black skin. They were able to rest there for a day, or I'm sorry, for the evening, I should say, the night. They were given food and rest. And then the next morning, according to Josiah, the family continued their march, determining that they were now only about 25 miles from Lake Erie. And spending one more night in the wilderness, Henson finally reached Sandusky, Ohio. He hid his family in the bushes just outside of the city, kind of to go in and make sure that they could find safe passage across Lake Erie. Sandusky is a port city right on Lake Erie. Henson approached a crew that was busy loading a ship, and he gathered as much information as he can, but carefully only approached the African American gentleman that was busy working and loading the ship with grain, who introduced him to the ship's captain, Captain Barnham. Josiah writes, "By his frank look and manner soon induced to me to acknowledge my condition and purpose, I found I had not mistaken. He sympathized with me at once, most heartily, and offered the family passage to Buffalo, New York. The captain had agreed to send a boat for me after sundown, rather than take me on board at the landing, as there were Kentucky spies, he said, on the watch for slaves at Sandusky, who might get a glimpse of me if I had brought my party out of the bush by daylight." Josiah stood on the dock and watched the ship pull away, and anxiety grows inside of him. He's completely worried that they're just going to leave and not come back and not uphold their promise or their agreement. However, at twilight, he notices that a boat is dropped off the side and returns back to shore. He loads his family, they return to the boat, and they arrive in Buffalo, but too late to embark on their last leg. So the family heads to Waterloo, New York, where they board a ferry boat. Josiah writes, "When I got to Canada side on the morning of October 28th, 1830, my first impulse was to throw myself on the ground, giving way to the riotous exaltations of my feelings. And there was a crowd watching him, shocked at his behavior. And one gentleman remarked on the joys of freedom could encourage somebody to behave in such a manner. The Henson's journey demonstrates how there really wasn't an organization. There was a lot of unknown, a lot of fear, and uncertainty as they traveled on the Underground Railroad. Another story is the story of William Wells Brown. He was born a slave about 1814 in Kentucky, and decided in January of 1834 to take the opportunity to leave the steamer that he had been working on the Ohio River. As they were unloading the steamer at the port, he simply disappeared into the crowded wharf, hiding in the woods until midnight. He writes, knowing well that I could not travel even in the state of Ohio during the day without danger of being arrested. I had long since made up my mind that I was not going to trust myself in the hands of any man, white or colored. The slave had brought up to look upon every white man as an enemy to him and his race, and 21 years in slavery had taught me that there were traitors even among the colored people. But as he starts off on his journey, he's completely unsure of which way to go. And there had been a clouded sky. And he kind of stood in one spot, kind of wondering where to go, how to start off on his journey. And he was looking in vain for the North Star. And then finally, as the clouds clear, he caught sight of what he writes is his friend, the North Star. But being winter, he suffered tremendously from the cold, but he was determined not to get help because I knew of a man belonging to General Ashley of St. Louis who had run away near Cincinnati on the way to Washington and had been caught and carried back into slavery. And I felt that a similar fate awaited me should I be seen by anyone. While traveling, Brown dreamed of freedom, and he decided shed his master's name, Sanford, adopt his old name, William. And then after 5 or 6 days of traveling, he was suffering so much from cold and hunger that he found rest in a barn. And the thought of death wasn't frightful to him compared to that of being caught and again being carried back into slavery. Nothing but the prospect of enjoying liberty could have induced him to undergo such trials. This and this alone carried him forward. But he was hungry and cold, so he had determined that if he was far enough north, that he was going to seek help. And he crossed paths with a Quaker, Wells Brown, who brought him into his home. Wells Brown informed him that he was only about 50 or 60 miles north of Dayton and that he needed to push further north. William, as a tribute to this help, takes the name Wells Brown once he reaches freedom. So he pushed north again, and his provisions ran short again after 4 days of walking through Ohio wilderness, and he approached a farmhouse asking for assistance. The man answers the door, and William Wells Brown is hesitant to tell him that he is a fugitive, and the man says, well, if you want some food, you're going to have to work for it. So Wells Brown decides to turn around and not take the food. But then a woman comes up to the door and pushes her husband aside and offers him food. After giving me as much food as I could eat, she presented me with 10 cents, which was all that she had, as well as a note to her friend who lived a few miles further up the road. Thanking this angel of mercy from an overflowing heart, I pushed my way and in 3 days arrived in Cleveland, Ohio. So this sounds like an organized attempt of the Underground Railroad, that this woman gives this note and maybe directs him to the next house where he's going to be able to find assistance or help. William Wells Brown does not mention whether he stopped or didn't stop at this next house. But I've also found in my research that this could be complete happenstance, that this wasn't necessarily planned, but rather a gentleman showed up asking for help. He had no idea if this farmhouse was a stop on the Underground Railroad or not a stop on the Underground Railroad. So we see this random act of kindness, and we look back on that and kind of group it into this abolitionist movement, a person looking past the color of one's skin or the color of or the state of one's condition. If you can imagine him walking in the cold for so many days, the state of one's condition, and offering help to another human. Brown spent the winter in Cleveland, and in the spring he found work on a Lake Erie steamship, and he himself then became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He actually worked on Lake Erie on a steamer for 1 or 2 years, And in that time, he would help escort individuals between Buffalo and Detroit, stopping at various port cities in Ohio, but then offloading individuals at Malden, Canada. Another example is the story of Henry Bibbs. Bibbs was born on a Kentucky plantation in 1815 and longed for liberty. He escaped the institution of slavery 4 times in an effort to be constantly reunited with his first wife and daughter. So I'm going to just look at his first attempt to escape slavery. He starts his first journey in December of 1837, and upon arriving in Cincinnati, he's unsure of which direction to go. So he asked a group of young boys that he sees playing in the street some kind of general random questions. Can you direct me to the old, he uses the word colored, to the old color man's home who saws wood? And the boys are like, do you know his name? And he says, no. And they say, oh, well, you must be talking about Job Dundee. And he says, oh, yes, that's the gentleman I'm looking for. And he goes and he knocks on his door, and he's welcomed into Mr. Dundee's home. And in his home, Mr. Dundee encourages Henry Bibbs and tells him of a group of abolitionists and this idea of the Underground Railroad and how he can receive help for his journey. So in Cincinnati, he's given provisions and a little bit of money so that he can start his journey. And upon reaching the home of his next stop, he doesn't stop because he's terrified that he's going to be caught. So he goes on walking by himself for the next 48 hours without food or rest, struggling against the external difficulties, such as no one can imagine who has never experienced the same. Not knowing what moment I might be captured while traveling among strangers through cold and fear, breasting the north wind, being thinly clad, pelted by the snow storms through the dark hours of the night, and not a house in which I could enter and shelter me from the storm. The second night from Cincinnati, about midnight, I thought I should freeze. My shoes were worn through, my feet were exposed, and I approached a house on the roadside, knocked at the door, asked admission, and was refused. I went to the next house, asked admission, and was refused. Finally, I found hiding in a barn where I could seek shelter. The next morning, hungry, I stopped and asked a woman for some breakfast, but he had kind of scavenged or hunted out the area beforehand, knowing that this was that this woman was home by herself for breakfast. And in this act of kindness, the woman gives him half a loaf of bread. Her random act of kindness emboldens Bibb, and he starts to kind of trust his surroundings. He starts to stop in public houses and paying for his fares. Now, when he gets to his public house up in northern Ohio, in Wood County, Ohio, he realizes that he can't afford his night stay because of the wildcat banks in the area and paper money having such inflation. So he offers to work for his overnight lodging, and they agree. So he works for his overnight lodging, he gets up in the morning, he leaves, and he makes his way to the banks of the Maumee River in Perrysburg, Ohio. And in Perrysburg, he finds refuge with an African American community that was in Perrysburg that winter before he made the attempt to return back to Kentucky to rescue his wife and daughter. Now, this is about late 1840s. What's interesting is he talks about this African American community in Perrysburg, Ohio. And when we look at the census records from 1850 in Perrysburg, there are 12 African Americans living in Perrysburg, Ohio. So we're not talking about huge communities when we're looking at this. Often enslaved individuals melted into these northern Black communities rather than being whisked away through secret tunnels and hidden in secret rooms. As these 3 examples show, it was really a little bit of luck that guided them on their way and strong determination. Griffler, a historian, argues that African Americans played a central role in the development and operation of the Underground Railroad, which he says is the first interracial liberation movement. These narratives document the Underground Railroad along the Ohio River, but also note long stretches of wilderness and uncertainty as they're traveling through Ohio. They go long distances. And when we get up into Northwest Ohio, just to give you an idea here, oh, I lost my pointer. You can see Urbana. See, oh, there we go. You can see Urbana down here. This marker noted David Adams is actually Findlay, Ohio, but you can see up here where Perrysburg is. So this area of Ohio is actually the last to be settled because of the Great Black Swamp. So settlement in this area of Ohio really starts in the 1820s, 1830s, after the construction of some major roads, the completion of the Miami Erie Canal, and the technology to drain the Great Black Swamp. Northwest Ohio kind of merged two general routes that had various crisscross branches in Ohio. And while these accounts are not as early, David Adams starts to get involved in the Underground Railroad about the 1830s. David Adams is an African-American barber, and he actually grew up in Urbana. His father, Lewis Adams, and grandfather, Frank Reno, were operators on the Underground Railroad, and David worked with both of them as a young boy, helping escort individuals through Urbana. When David settles in Findlay, he becomes very involved in the Underground Railroad as well. And he talks about operating on the Underground Railroad. He notes in his oral history to Wilbert Siebert that he never knew the names of the members of the party or the conductor that had been guiding them. He typically escorted individuals to one house, the home of Uncle John King, and they would stay there for one night, getting rest and food, and then David Adams would return the next morning with a wagon that had been loaded with boxes and potatoes and hay and oats, and they would hide all amongst these goods. And then Adams would take them 37 miles north to Perrysburg. In Perrysburg, he would connect with the African-American barber that lived in Perrysburg, where individuals would find help. From Perrysburg, they would be escorted across the Maumee River into Maumee, Ohio, and turned over to another African-American barber, William Merritt. Also, what's interesting about the account with David Adams is that he worked with the federal U.S. Marshal in the area as well, Absalom Biel, who would warn participants that slave catchers were coming into the area. And often he would keep the slave catchers busy so that David Adams and the other individuals that he worked with in Findlay would help escort people aside. Now, the places here where I live, this actually started off as a public history project for me. So the places where I live, the activities in Perrysburg, Maumee, and Sylvania and Toledo are not as well documented. Here is where we have this idea of a lot of local legend and local lore coming together. Everybody grows up knowing that the house around the corner was a stop on the Underground Railroad, or we have these stories of tunnels and secret rooms in different houses throughout these areas. So we do see this romantic image portraying itself as in the Underground Railroad, and the safety that it offered to escaping slaves in the home of white conductors is not necessarily supported in the historical literature. Rather, the historical record reveals a confusing mess of understanding race and human rights in multicultural democracy. Ohio kind of has this ambiguous relationship. We supported federal slave laws, we passed black codes, we passed kidnapping laws, but the slave narratives reveal to us a fear and uncertainty when traveling through Ohio, while at the same time showing gratitude for random acts of kindness. While the records support an organization, it also shows the uncertainty and the inability to kind of have an organization when traveling through the Underground Railroad. So I think I can open it up for questions. I see my moderator back online with my little 5-minute warning here.
Yeah, but you know what? Even if we don't have enough time for questions, we will be moving on to the discussion area eventually. So, but does anyone have any questions? We have a few minutes. Um, I actually have one. So
Okay.
it seems like the Underground Railroad was sort of disorganized in many ways. Do you think that sort of disorganization kind of helped it become a success?
I do. I think it absolutely helped it to become a success, but it also is the historian's nightmare for documentation as well. Um, it did help it to become a success because one thing that I'm finding as I research, I'm focusing in on this northwest corner of Ohio, and one thing I'm finding is kind of everybody knew
Mhm.
everybody knew. They talk about like, oh, David Haroon, and he was kind of this rabble rouser in Sylvania. And people knew that he was on the Underground Railroad, the conductor on the Underground Railroad. But it took that whole community of everybody looking the other way, not really caring, but also not knowing, right? Not knowing when he was gonna travel down to Maumee, or not knowing if they were at his house. But that chaos too is he talks about hiding them in his barn. And then if the slave catchers were in quick pursuit, he would escort them to somebody else's house.
Mhm.
Um, so I definitely think that worked completely to their advantage.
Yeah, I thought so too, because that's one thing that struck me because you had, I think it was William Wells, no, Henry Bibbs, where he just happened upon this lady who I know that's what I was like. And then the one that struck me, my favorite one was Aunt Polly. I wrote that one, the fact that she was I that she was dressing up as an older woman. Do you feel like some of them, I know it sounds crazy, but wearing costumes to try to
Oh, there are so many accounts. Writing this is actually very hard because it's like information overload and you just have tiny little nuggets of information. But there's accounts of men dressing as women, women dressing as men. There was one account where David Adams actually put a person in a coffin and then drove the coffin to Perrysburg. Um, so there are, and again, that's where the creativity, you're only limited by your creativity. Um, so yes, there were all sorts of different accounts, but the Polly Jackson is also interesting when we look at African American women, that because she was an old African American woman, she wasn't
Mhm.
a threat. So that is a whole nother layer of understanding race and gender in
Yeah.
American history.
Yeah, that fits perfectly actually. So
Right,
I have
exactly.
I know with the whole theme of this. There's one more question and then we have to head out, but is
Okay.
there, Batia was wondering if there is an underground museum, an underground railroad museum in Ohio?
There is. In Cincinnati is called the National Underground Railroad Museum. It's in Cincinnati, and it's at the actual old train station in
Mhm.
Cincinnati.
Oh, how cool is that?
So I
Well,
think if you just Google Underground Railroad in Cincinnati, it should come right up.
well, I actually, if I'm ever in Ohio, Cincinnati, I'll definitely go. This was super interesting. I really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it, and thank you everyone for attending this session. And thank you again to Janet. And this is a good time for a short break. But if anyone's interested, please go to the Zoom meeting.